Hello, everyone. I hope everyone is healthy, safe, and well. I am Victoria Borders, a program specialist at the Blank Foundation focused on democracy and racial justice. I'm proud and privileged to apply my passion for voting rights to my work at the foundation on behalf of our chairman and his family, who truly believe that everyone should have equal access to the right to vote, and they're taking the adequate steps to make that vision a reality. We've supported various organizations on democracy and barriers to the ballot box, and over the next several weeks, we hope you will join us in a conversation series highlighting the work of our democracy grantees. And as we learn even more about where we are, how far we have to go. For today's discussion, we have with us Ms. Wendy Weiser. Wendy directs the democracy program at the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU School of Law. Her program focuses on voting rights and elections, money and politics and ethics, redistricting and representation, government dysfunction, rule of law, and fair courts. Wendy does a lot. She founded and directed the program's Voting Rights and Elections Project, directing litigation, research, and advocacy efforts to enhance political participation and prevent voter disenfranchisement across the country. She is a frequent public speaker and media commentator on all things democracy. She has appeared on virtually every major network and published in major news outlets across the country, and has served as an adjunct professor at the NYU School of Law. Without further ado, I want to hop right in with Wendy to talk about why voting rights are such a politically charged issue now and historically. So, with that being said, Wendy, how are you? How are you quarantining?
I am getting by. I mean, fortunately, my family and I are healthy and delighted to be able to speak with you remotely.
Awesome. So tell us this, much of your work is rooted in research. So right now, what is the research telling us around voting?
Well, it's telling us some good things and some disturbing things. On the positive side, it's telling us that there is an unprecedented enthusiasm for voting this year. We are seeing not only are polls telling us that voters are very enthusiastic, but we're seeing record level turnout in primaries across the country, despite all of the challenges, and there are significant challenges. The research is also telling us that there are really serious and in many ways unprecedented challenges to the franchise this year. And there were challenges even before the coronavirus hit. We are now a decade into a real concerted effort to restrict access to voting across the country. And in 25 states, there are laws in place that make it harder to vote this year than it was in 2010. So over this decade, we've been going backwards in many ways on voting rights. And the new voting restrictions have been especially targeted towards voters of color, and also burden others like elderly, disabled voters, also younger voters as well. So that's sort of one challenge. Another challenge is we are also facing an unprecedented threat of foreign interference from foreign adversaries. And it's not just Russia this time. There are other countries and foreign adversaries that are also getting in the mix. And our nation's intelligence officials are telling us that it's really a red alert. This is across the country. They're trying to not only mount cyber attacks against our election infrastructure, but there's a lot of disinformation efforts and social media disruption efforts to sow discord and confusion around this election. And then last and most obviously, the big threat for this election and for voting is the coronavirus itself, which is just creating massive problems nationwide and obstacles for voters. Fortunately, it's not dampening enthusiasm, but as you know, it is changing the way Americans vote in big ways and small ways, because the entire voting process creates a risk to health and safety for many Americans. So we've seen a massive surge in requests for absentee and mail voting. Most Americans, at least 76%, are, even before the coronavirus, had the right to vote by mail or absentee without providing any reason at all or excuse. And it used to be a small percentage of them requested it, 25% in the last few federal presidential elections, but that in some states like Georgia, for example, it was closer to 6%. In the usual elections. In those states, we've seen it surge up to 70%, 80%. I mean, more than half the voters are expected to vote by mail this year, which is a dramatic change. We've also seen huge challenges at the polling places, with poll workers calling in sick or unable to work, with polling place closures across the country, also because they're sited in sensitive locations where it's not healthy to host voting. And that's resulted, the combination of those factors have resulted in incredibly and unconscionably long lines in many places across the country, including in places that your foundation is especially interested, which further risks health and safety of voters and election officials alike. And then we're seeing pressures after Election Day, where election administrators have been having trouble counting all those ballots and getting the election processed in time. And so these are some of the pressures along the way. We're seeing voters being left out. There are all sorts of problems where people are being disenfranchised. We're seeing people then also trying to sow distrust into the election outcomes. And that's creating confusion and upset. So that's sort of the challenges we see. There's a lot of data behind that, but it's really three separate buckets of challenges that are colliding all at once in this very hotly contested election season this year.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you. And I also want to highlight the Brennan Center had some wins this year as it relates to the response to COVID and voting. Did you want to talk a little bit about that at all?
So there have been, so I was describing some of the problems we've been seeing. There's also been good news across the country. And before we even get to COVID, when I'm talking about how it's been getting harder to vote across the country, in many ways, it's also been getting easier to vote across the country. And I'm going to flag just two trends to give an example of this, but over the last 3 years alone, we've seen a dramatic surge in states adopting automatic voter registration. So where anybody who interacts with government agencies and is an eligible voter and wants to is automatically added to the voter rolls without having to take additional steps. And that's now been in more than 17 states in DC. This is going through in New York just now as well. So that's going to be yet another win. And that has led to dramatic increases in voter registration rates across the country. And Georgia is one of those states that have also adopted automatic voter registration. And that has been something that we've worked on. In fact, it was built off a policy proposal that the Brennan Center put together. And it has been removing barriers to voter registration across the country and leading to dramatic increases in voter registration rates. And in Georgia, for example, it increased by 94% voter registration after it was put into place. There are some other obstacles to voting. Some voters are being purged from the voter rolls. We can talk about that as well, but this is a real positive thing. Another really great trend that we've seen over the last 2 decades is making it easier for people with past criminal convictions to have their voting rights restored. And it is now the case that there are no more states in the country, for the first time as of just a few weeks ago, that permanently disenfranchise citizens with past criminal convictions as a result of a law that just passed in Iowa. Another great victory that the Brennan Center is very proud to have been part of. It was a ballot initiative that passed in Florida in 2018 that would restore voting rights to 1.4 million Americans with past criminal convictions Unfortunately, that's been met with a legislative backlash, and the Florida legislature then, after that huge and resounding victory by Florida's voters. It was more than roughly 2/3 of Florida's voters actually voted to restore voting rights to their fellow citizens and voted for forgiveness and recognizing that second chances are important. This Florida legislature has added a new obstacle and said that people have to pay their criminal justice debt, added this significant new cost to becoming eligible to vote. That is being litigated. We are proud to be part of the team that is fighting back against this. There's going to be an argument next week before the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals. Hopefully, because right now many Floridians have their voting rights in question because of the ups and downs of this litigation, but that's a huge set of victories. Another really important thing to note is that over the last year, there's been or the last 6 months, there have been a lot of movement in states across the country to eliminate barriers to absentee and mail voting, to enable to facilitate that choice for the many Americans who are worried about showing up at polling places for whom that's the healthiest option to vote this year. And for example, in 16 states, ordinarily voters are required to provide some sort of excuse in order to vote by mail. In 10 of those states, in the primary, everybody was able to vote regardless of providing any excuse. And there's been now already 5 of them have made it clear that they're going to do that for November. And that's, I assume there's going to be a further cascade of those jurisdictions. We are working on that. We are working on ensuring that election administrators help facilitate the exercise of that right for people who do want to vote by mail, making sure that everybody gets at least an application, if not a ballot in the mail, without having to take additional steps, making sure that there's a path for voters who are put on a list, who are deemed inactive, whose registrations are in the process of being examined as to whether or not they've moved, that they too are not excluded from the ability to vote and vote by mail, and that there's a process for them to get ballots. And there have been victories across the country and successes in moving those rules and ensuring that voters have access. There still are many barriers in place. Some of them are being litigated. We are certainly involved in some of those lawsuits. Some of them are subject to ongoing negotiations with election administrators and legislators across the country. There are not much time left, but I think there's I think that many more Americans will see some easing of their path to absentee and mail voting before the election rolls around. And there's also been a lot of victories in shoring up polling places. Around the country, we saw extremely long lines, especially in urban voting centers. We obviously around the Atlanta and in DeKalb counties, we saw extremely long lines, but we saw them in Wisconsin, we saw them in DC, we saw them in Indiana, we saw them in Philadelphia. These were all across the country. The same problems were happening. And there are a lot of steps that need to happen in order to ensure that there are enough polling places, that they are safe, and that everybody can access them easily. And a lot of changes are being made now, and we're part of those efforts as well, to try to ensure that that nobody has to wait in those kind of unconscionably long lines that we saw in the primaries. So that's just some of the things we're working on and some of the things that are going on. But it's not all bad news. There's a big mobilization of not just the Brennan Center, many allies and groups on the ground are mobilizing to seek these changes. And actually, the biggest needed change actually is just getting the basic resources to election administrators, because the coronavirus has created these unprecedented administration challenges. Part of why we're seeing all these long lines is they didn't have the infrastructure in place to handle the kind of election that they need to have during a pandemic. And everybody knows what to do. It's not rocket science, but they don't have the resources to make those changes and do it. We were part of an effort and helped to lead this effort to push for Congress to allocate funds to the states to make the changes that they need. We helped secure $400 million earlier in the year. That is only a small fraction of what is needed. This fight is going on right now. The President of the United States weighed in a negative way over the last couple of days, but I think that there's still a significant need for additional funds. There's still a few billion short in the states in order to make all these changes, ensure everybody's safety, and ensure that the ballots are counted on time. And we're also looking at other options for how to make sure that states have the resources they need and localities to make that happen.
You mentioned two things. One, the purging of voters from rolls, and then you also, and we'll get into that. And also, two, I just want to be very clear because there might be some folks that are listening that don't know. Is there a difference between absentee and mail-in voting?
No, those are just different words used in different jurisdictions for the same thing, where you, instead of going to a polling place to get a ballot, you receive your ballot in the mail from election officials. Some states call that mail voting, some states call it absentee voting. There are other words for it. There are a variety of different ways in which states administer that. Some states send everybody a ballot who's a registered voter. Some states send everybody a ballot application. Some states require people to apply for an application, to apply for a ballot, and so that add those up. So there are different policies people have in place. I think the last one is way too cumbersome this year, especially for the volume of people who need to use this method of voting. But it's the same thing. And you don't even need to submit your ballot by mail if you're voting absentee or by mail. And in fact, many people don't. Many people submit their ballots at election offices in states where you can do that. There are ballot drop boxes, and those are, Georgia's just invested in those as well, and many states have as well. So there are 5 states actually where the main way that people vote is by mail. And that's sort of that's the principal method of voting. They do automatically send everybody a ballot because that is their principal method of voting. They do have polling places because it doesn't work for everybody. Not everybody has an address. There's also problems. Sometimes ballots are lost in the mail. You need to have some other option for people. But in those states, most people actually hand in their ballots in person. They don't even use the mail. So the mail voting is really how you receive your ballot, not necessarily how you send it. Some people send it by mail, some people submit it otherwise.
And then the purging, so what is purging voters from the rolls? And does Georgia do it the same way every other state does, or do we do it differently? Is it done differently in every state? Tell us more about that.
Sure. In order to vote in every state, except for Nebraska, you need to be registered to vote. And states maintain a computerized list of all registered voters. That's the voter rolls, and it's on a computer. And all states need to keep that list up to date. If you change your address, that needs to be reflected on the voter rolls. If you move out of the state or if you die, you need to be removed from the voter roll. So there is nothing wrong. In fact, it's perfectly appropriate and desirable for states to maintain and do this kind of list maintenance to maintain the voter rolls up to date. But sometimes, and sometimes in order to do so, states look for people who they think moved, who they think died, who they think became ineligible. Fewer and fewer people are because of a criminal conviction, and then try to remove them from the voter rolls. And if they do so in a large scale or ham-handed way, sometimes they identify many people who are in fact eligible voters. They're not ineligible. They have not died. They have not moved. They have not become ineligible in any way. And so it's a very painstaking process to identify and then verify and then only remove people that you're sure are ineligible. But because of the different practices in place in different states, and everybody does it differently. Sometimes you see bad purges of the voter rolls where lots of people are deleted from the voter rolls, and it encompasses a large number of people who shouldn't have been deleted, who should have stayed registered to vote. Again, some of these are perfectly legitimate removals, but we've been seeing, and our research has shown that in the last couple of years, the number of people that are being purged and removed from the voter rolls nationwide has been increasing. And between the last two federal elections, we saw 16 million, 17 million Americans being removed from the voter rolls nationwide in each of those 2-year periods. That's a dramatic increase over what we've seen before. And we've seen, and this is just some of the Brennan Center's research, that where this is happening is not evenly spread across the country. And the states where we saw real spikes in these large-scale removals from the voter rolls are the states that used to be required under the Federal Voting Rights Act to get permission before making changes to their voting laws. They're states that had a history of discrimination, or jurisdictions that had a history of discrimination in voting practice. Those were the places where we saw much bigger spikes in the purge rates. And Georgia is among those states, and we did see those spikes in Georgia, and there were, I think we saw 11 million purged in one cycle in recent years in Georgia. So these are, significant numbers, and they raise questions. It used to be that the Department of Justice would look at these new large-scale purge programs and assess whether or not they were likely to be discriminatory before they were allowed to move forward in those jurisdictions. Because the Supreme Court has gutted this core provision of the Voting Rights Act, the Department of Justice no longer reviews these voting changes before they happen, or states can go to federal court, if not the Department of Justice. And so there's nobody that's checking to make sure that it's not discriminatory. And we're seeing more and more large-scale purges that are, in fact, having a more negative impact on communities of color across the country. And one of the very controversial purge methods, and this is one that actually the Supreme Court has allowed to go forward, that we've seen increase in recent years, are states removing people from the voter rolls. And it's only a small number of states, but it's a large number of people that are affected. Removing people simply because they haven't voted and then didn't respond to a piece of mail that was sent to them afterwards. And you're not supposed to, under federal law, remove people just for not voting, but if they don't vote and they get the piece of mail and don't respond to it, the court has somehow let those purges proceed. And all of this points to the fact that if you're properly registered to vote, that doesn't necessarily mean that you haven't been flagged mistakenly to be removed from the voter rolls by your election administrator. So what every voter should do, and this is a great time to do it, is check. Make sure that your registration is up to date. Make sure it's still there. If it's not there, it's not too late to re-register and make sure it's there. If you've moved, make sure that you tell your election administrator your new address so that the address can be updated, especially now if you want to get your ballot by mail. It goes to the address on the voter file. So if you've moved, you will not go, or if your mail is forwarded, it will be subject to significant delay before it reaches you. So both the fact that there are purges going on or have been going on, and the fact that there's a pandemic going on should motivate you right now. Go online in the vast majority of the states where you can do this online, or call your election official, make sure that you're registered and your registration is up to date.
Awesome, awesome. So in your mind, Wendy, what is a true democracy?
Well, a true democracy is a system where everybody has an opportunity to have a say over how they're governed and what happens in their community. And it works best if each and every eligible citizen actually participates in our elections. And that is something that is deeply important to us. That is why we work on trying to prevent efforts to suppress votes, to knock out eligible voters or impose hurdles on their path. and look for other ways to try to encourage and to set up a system that's not only welcoming for every single American community, but that actually makes it easier for them and encourages them to participate so they can have a say in their communities over what happens to them and their families.
You have authored publications and articles on voting rights and election reform. You've litigated groundbreaking lawsuits on democracy issues. You've testified before both houses of Congress and on a variety of state legislative issues. You've provided legislative and policy drafting assistance to federal and state legislatures and administrators across the country. I don't know probably a more accomplished person than yourself, but what has been the toughest part of your work?
Wow, that's a tough question. There's a lot that's tough here. I think that, what has been the hardest for me lately is watching us move backwards, watching gains and wins being taken away, watching rights that were won becoming lost. I mean, just the Florida example I gave, I mean, it was so inspiring to watch Floridians vote to restore voting rights. And it was so emotional for all of those citizens who were now able to participate as full members of their communities. And for many of them, this was an affirmation of their worth and of their ability to really contribute to their communities. And then to watch that be taken away by the Florida legislature for so many of them, and then to have to fight again, how demoralizing that is. And to watch right now the Congress of the United States and the President of the United States be willfully reckless, blind to the needs of the state, for our state and local election administration infrastructure, just to allow that to falter. In the United States of America, we're supposed to be the leading democracy of the world, and just like sabotaging or allowing the election administrators to fail is that's really demoralizing, given how far we've come and how many gains we've had. That's kind of what's hard. I mean, certainly watching the core provisions of the Voting Rights Act, I mean, that has been the most successful piece of civil rights legislation in our nation's history, and watching that central piece be taken away and struck down by the US Supreme Court, and then having Congress just sit and not pass the law to restore it. Like, both of those things have been very demoralizing after decades and decades of broad bipartisan consensus on that this is like a super statute, like a core part of who we are as a nation and what our values are. We're represented by that Voting Rights Act, and just allowing that to atrophy. So that's demoralizing. I want to say, though, I am hopeful now. I am hopeful that there's going to be a turning over of a new leaf, and that we're going to have a real opportunity next year to not only reverse those reversals, but to really leap forward and try, and in a big way, repair all of this damage that's being done to our democracy, and move a lot closer towards a truly fair and representative democracy that actually is for the people and centers the people, not corporations and not the political party that is in power, but the people at the core of our process, and they're at the core of our system. There are big congressional statutes that have a lot of mobilization around them that could restore the Voting Rights Act, that can transform democracy in the For the People Act, HR 1. We've seen already momentum in state after state of people taking, reversing gerrymandering and putting in place new efforts to expand voting rights and try to stem money in politics. So there's a real moment where, and obviously we're grappling in a really big and important and much needed way with the legacy of systemic racism in our society that is also infused all of these challenges to our democracy. And so I'm hopeful right now that we're actually about to turn a corner. And so while all of these setbacks are been really demoralizing, this is what's driving me forward, is all the people that are mobilizing right now on the ground, who passed Amendment 4 in Florida, who are mobilizing in state after state this year to get people registered and ensure that they can get ballots by mail, who are working to try to overturn gerrymandering, who are working to mobilize for Black lives in cities across and states across America. I mean, this is a real moment of ferment and of hope. And I think that we need to harness that energy and say, we can do this. This is not our fate. This is America. What we've been living through is not America. We do not undermine voting rights. We do not try to sabotage our democracy. We're gonna make it better.
I was reading a quote the other day that from President Barack Obama. Basically, he was stating that history doesn't always go in a straight line. And so, meaning sometimes there's some detours. And I in thinking of that, I think back to when you and I first met, when you came to Atlanta in October of 2019. And Wendy, to be honest, it was because of a lot of the inspiration you and several others that were there that day inspired our organization to do even more in the space of voting rights. So we say thank you for your work and inspiring us to do more and to pull our weight in this space as well. And knowing that and thinking through that and knowing we all stand on the backdrop of Congressman Lewis, who is across our country, a dear friend and brother to Mr. Blank, and really just, an icon and it's not even a word that I can even use to describe him, quite frankly, what he means to Atlanta, Georgia, and our nation. But in that, and knowing that we are basically really just fighting for the Voting Rights Act again, in a sense, after it was gutted. What is next for Brennan Center for Justice? And, I know me and you have had a conversation before saying that there's things that there's legislation that needs to happen on the state level as well as the federal level in tandem with one another in order to see the kind of progress we need. And not only just restoring the Voting Rights Act itself, but also across election administration. So I would just love to hear, what is the future for voting in 2021 and beyond? What is the part that Brennan Center will continue to play, and how we can support your work continuously?
Well, thank you for that. And I'm so glad you mentioned Congressman Lewis, because he is an inspiration to us and should be an inspiration to the whole country to continue to make good trouble and bring about the changes that he has been fighting for. And that is what we intend to do. I mean, I would say it's not just after the election. There's a lot of work to do between now and the election to protect the election, to ensure no voter is left behind, and that every eligible citizen has the opportunity to vote and have their vote counted fairly and without their health. So that is, we are definitely committed to that through the election. But it doesn't stop there. We should not have to face these kinds of hurdles. It should not have to take a concerted mobilization of so many sectors of society just to get us to provide some basic support to ensure that our election infrastructure works well and that there aren't millions of lost votes. That should not be the case in America. And so we are committed to taking the pain of this situation and turning it into purpose and action in 2021 to make sure that we get laws passed, we get lawsuits fought that make sure that we are not in this situation again. And it's not just voting rights. I say across, we definitely need to restore the Voting Rights Act. That needs to happen on day one of the next Congress. We definitely need to pass H.R. 1, the For the People Act that I mentioned. That is a comprehensive democracy reform bill that, in addition to the Voting Rights Act, would solve a lot of these, almost every problem we've seen show up not only in this pandemic, but with all of this war on voting rights that we've seen over the last decade. But it would do more than that. It would also bolster the role of ordinary citizens in our campaign finance process through small donor public financing. It would end gerrymandering. And it would make other ethics reforms as well. So this is a comprehensive package that could really be transformative, making automatic voter registration nationwide, making rights restoration permanent and nationwide, among other things. So we're super committed to making sure those things happen on day one. And then we need to make sure that it's not just in Congress. All of these rights need to take hold and root in states and localities across the country. And so that's where we'll move next and simultaneously. We are already working in states across the country to implement these changes. And I will say that, the Voting Rights Act has to be federally, but all the stuff that's in HR 1, each and every one of those reforms is out there working effectively in states and localities across the country. We just need to bring that nationwide. But we're still powering forward in each state to make sure that if Congress doesn't pass it, that the states themselves can improve. And then, this is the voting rights throughout our history has been a constant struggle. You can never rest on your laurels. Like once they're won, they still need to be fought for and they need to be exercised. And so, what's next? If there's no more threat to voting rights, then, the big fight will be to make sure that each and every eligible American votes and has something to vote for.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, I'm going to end on this very last question, and it's more of a personal question. What does voting mean to you?
Wow. So, voting rights is the basic unit of everything, of our democracy, of our participation. It is the unit of our citizenship and how we, not only control what's going on in our community, but how we have a say over what kind of society we live in and ensure that it's a just society that treats everybody fairly and equitably. And when I go to vote, that's what I think about is what kind of society do I want to live in and how can I use my vote in a way that will, realize this vision that I'm talking about, that will make sure that everybody's lives and everybody's votes matter, and that realize that everybody can have self-determination in their own communities. And so I feel this, I feel a collective, not only responsibility, but I feel connected to everybody that everybody else when I cast my vote. And so it just feels good in that way. It feels like this is something that I'm doing for me and my family, but for all my fellow Americans. And I feel like everybody has that same voice, and that together we can bring about that vision.
Amazing. Well, Wendy, thank you for your work. Thank you for your commitment, and thank you for joining us today. We are forever grateful.
Thank you so much for everything that you guys are doing. It is such an inspiration, and I hope that you inspire so many others to take on these issues like you have in their communities. That's how we get there. That's how we get to that promised land.
Keeping up the fight. Good trouble.
Thank you.